Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on understanding risks and ensuring policy resilience, understanding the risks of climate change, that is. My name is Tim Benton. I'm a research director at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, and I've worked on issues to do with climate change and the risks associated with them for decades now. The topic of the panel today is about risks and how we translate from the risks into the policy environment to mitigate the risks in their totality, hopefully. And the point of today's session is really to ask a number of questions. And the first one is, what do we understand about the risks from climate change? So the traditional way of thinking about risks is that risk is some function of the hazard, the exposure to the hazard, and the vulnerability to the hazard. So the hazard might be extreme rainfall or extreme heat, which is obviously changing under climate change. The exposure is, if it's extreme rainfall, are you at the top of a hill or the bottom of a hill? Are you going to be exposed to the flood risk? And the vulnerability is associated with whether or not you have the ability to build flood defences, for example, and keep the risk at bay. Now, that's fine and is the traditional way of thinking about risk, hazard, exposure and vulnerability. But of course, we live in very much globally interconnected society. So the risks that we face in any given country or any given city are not just what's happening to the climate outside our window, but what's happening to the climate all around the world and how those hazards that happen in other places might interrupt the flow of goods into our countries or might create people movement that stress our borders, or that they might create hazards somewhere else that suck up a whole lot of finance that means that finance moves out of our countries. Or they might disrupt the flow of information, they might destabilise governments that leads to whole issues that affect our countries. So part of the issue around understanding the risks is not just understanding the hazards and the evolution of hazards, and this year alone has shown us that our understanding of climate models and how the hazards are going to evolve is fairly weak. We have a broad and quite robust, I think, understanding of the way that the average climate is going to change. We've got a much less robust understanding of the way extreme weather will change. We have a very poor understanding of whether or not the climate is going to hit some threshold and rapidly change. So, for example, the jet stream might lock into a new position. That becomes more wavy, which has given rise to a lot of the problems this year and in previous years in the decade. The Gulf Stream, driven by the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which powers a lot of heat from the tropics to northwest Europe, might slow down and stop. We might hit thresholds of ice melt that trap us into irreversible sea level rise. We don't understand those risks as well as we need to in terms of thinking about the planning, particularly with the tipping points. We don't understand when, if we do, we might hit them and what speed with which they might act. When it comes to the extreme weather, it's very difficult to predict in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years' time, what will the state of the jet stream be like? Will it be like this year where you have alternate blocks of a wavy jet stream sucking up heat from the tropics and unbearable heat in some places next to a downward wavy jet stream sucking cold, wet air from the north, leading to flooding? So this year we've had blocks of heat and flood all around the world. Will that be the same in 10 years' time, 20 years' time? Will it be worse? How do we plan for that? How do we build the resilient trade systems? How do we think about ensuring the stability of weak governance subject to climate risks? How do we make sure that when we live in an embedded world, we aren't subject to these systemic and cascading risks? And just before I leave the topic of systemic risk, the area where we are least well prepared is understanding the risks from climate change on ecological systems. So my background is in systems ecology, And what happens with climate change or land use change or whatever is that you squeeze different species that don't typically live together into new areas. And when that happens, the ecological balance gets disrupted and you get the emergence of new pests and diseases and all sorts of other things going on. And it might well be, for example, that COVID has some signal that comes from changing the distribution of animals so that new hosts are exposed to old diseases in new ways so that they can jump from species to species. So those sorts of risks that come from climate change, we have absolutely no ability to predict because they're just too uncertain. So as we look ahead, how will these risks evolve? That's the first question that we're going to ask. Then the next question we're going to ask in this panel is, given that those risks are happening, those risks are going to evolve, how do we best mitigate those risks? Do we aim to build resilient economies in our globalized worlds? Do we have resilient trade networks that are not based on just-in-time supply chains that can be easily disrupted if there's a climate hazard happening somewhere else? So just as an example, if you take, for example, the port of Shanghai, a third of the goods that flow around the world effectively go through the port of Shanghai out of China or into China. Were that to get disrupted, that would have immense and huge economic knock-on consequences to the whole world. What do we do? Do we say we need many more ports to distribute the flow of goods from China? Do we work with China and help China or other places build more and more sophisticated port technology? Do we have alternative supply routes? Do we get rid of our just-in-time supply chains and build big warehouses full of goods like we used to have to act as buffer stocks? All of those cost money, and we got rid of a lot of that in the name of efficiency. But efficiency is also vulnerability to these risks. So, first question, do we understand the risks? Second question is, what do we do about them? And part of the what do we do about them is also the mitigating climate change, as well as adapting to the risk, is also the mitigating climate change to limit the evolution of those risks into the future. And of course, if we're thinking about mitigating climate change and a transition to a low-carbon economy, that comes with risks in sense of geoeconomics, in sense of livelihoods, in sense of just transitions, and so on. So how do we balance the risks that we know are growing from the climate hazards and the evolution of the climate hazards against the risks of doing things in different ways, and so on? So how do we build the resilience to the risks, and are we doing enough? Those are the kind of broad questions that I want us to address in this panel. So we have an absolutely fantastic group of people, and I'm really honoured to be here with such a really brilliant panel. So we're going to go through in the order that I'll address the questions, I think. To my immediate left, we have a climate expert, Lučka Kajfež Bogataj, approximately, from the University of Ljubljana. Then we have an expert who will allow us to interface between national and European policy. This is Tina Kobilšek, approximately, who's the Slovenian head of delegation to the UNFCCC and lead negotiator, also Slovenian national focal point, and works for the Slovenian EU presidency 2021, dealing with international climate change negotiations and COP26. Then on screen, we have Koko Werner, who is a vulnerability expert. Hello, Koko, lovely to see you again. She guides the UN Climate Secretariat's Adaptation Knowledge Hub as head of the Vulnerability Subdivision. Also has been an IPCC lead author, and at the UNFCCC has also supervised loss and damage workstream. Nice to see you. Then we have Nick Bridge, who is representing the UK government in the role of the COP presidency, Special Representative for Climate Change in the FCDO. Then on screen, Elina Bardram. Hello, Elina. Who is Acting Director, International Mainstreaming and Policy Coordination Directorate, DG Clima, who can talk about mainstream policy solutions internationally. And then last but not least, Live with us today, our climate finance and investment expert is Werner, President of the European Investment Bank. So that's our panel, brilliant group of people. And what I want to do is just ask 3 rounds of questions to the panel, and then we'll have hopefully some time for Q&A from you guys at the end. And these questions, for each person to be answered from their perspective. Do we understand the risks and their evolution? Second round of questions will be, what should we do about those risks in terms of either mitigating the hazards or mitigating the risks? So mitigation of climate and adaptation to the risks. And then the third question, if we have time, are we doing enough? So what are the risks? What should we be doing? And is there a gap between those two? And then we'll have the Q&A. So let's, without further ado, start off. So first question, how well do we understand the risks and their evolution? Lučka.
Hello from my side. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Do we understand risks? To a certain degree, yes. We are good at understanding physical risks. We all experience flood or seen it on TV. We know what drought is, strong winds are. Okay, so we have a good idea what kind of damage can that cause, but we are not aware fully of other risks, economics risks. For instance, you were talking about how global economy will suffer from chain of events or some surprises that may come. We are not fully aware of social risks because you're mentioning climate change refugees. This definition is not even really understood in many places, not even within UN, what is the status of climate migrant, but it already exists. You can see things happening, for instance, 10 years ago, climatic things like drought in Syria. This was probably the start of Syrian crisis, climate change issue. And also, we are not fully aware of ecological risk. You were mentioning the ecosystems. The most worrying thing is that we are not aware of the speed and rising probability of these risks, because many people, I've been talking about climate change, they all feel deep inside it is a matter of our grandchildren. They will experience these risks, but probability of quick climate change happening is increasing, and the last IPCC report clearly indicates that.
Thank you very much, Lučka. Koko, can I actually turn to you next? I got my order wrong. As a vulnerability expert, how do you think we understand the risks that come from climate change?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. And hello, everyone from Bonn, Germany. We're here getting ready, as some of you are, for our climate negotiations at COP26 in Glasgow. So it's really great to join you. I wanted to highlight, just pick up on the IPCC. As many of you saw in the news, the IPCC has released its first of 3 parts of its 6th assessment cycle. And there are a couple of things, actually just one, that I wanted to highlight, and then I'll respond to your question, Tim. So the summary for policymakers has stated that, based on the best available science, crossing a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature range in global warming as a 20-year average will occur in the early 2030s. The reason that that pops out to me is, Tim, you've asked, it's actually the next question, but what do we do about this risk? Do we understand it? We don't really understand the pace, the intensity, the scale of climate change impacts, but knowing that there's a likelihood of the Earth's temperature, average temperature passing that 1.5 degree, let's say, threshold is reason for concern. And we already have a lot of lived evidence in the past 2 years of temperatures going to levels that humanity has not seen. Homo sapiens have not experienced. And I think that is a clarion call for action. What this means for understanding risk, maybe we can just take a quick tip that often in the IPCC world, the temperature, how high the temperature goes, is a proxy for understanding what risk might mean for impacts on humans and the natural systems that they depend upon. So the closer that we get to higher temperatures, the greater frequency and magnitude of events, and even crossing some planetary thresholds that may be irreversible on timescales that are relevant for human society. So we're talking centuries, millennia, and onwards. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Koko. So moving on from the kind of the science of the climate change and the international climate governance area, Tina, as UNFCCC focal point and expert in local and European position, are you happy that you have enough of a grasp on the speed and the evolution of the risks to be able to manage them through the policy process?
Thank you, Tim, and good afternoon to everyone also from my side. I'm very honored to be here, part of this exquisite panel. I think it's important to mention at first that we know how grave the impacts of climate change already for a long time. And as the recent report of the Working Group 1 contribution to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report approved again, is something that the world must act now if we want to avoid the adverse impacts of climate change. And what really matters is how fast and in how intensive we work towards that. As Lučka mentioned, I think we are all aware of these physical risks that are all around us, and obviously by now in all parts of the world. Not only basically in this, what we call the most vulnerable, and let's say the island states, but also in Europe, also in the US, in Canada, and so. I think this is something that we are well aware of, but I think we also have to acknowledge better that all these regions are not isolated, and also the risks and the impacts are not isolated. And indeed, I think there is much more that we would need to understand in this regard. But I think the systemic risks, the cascading risks, are something that we should also be more profoundly looking into and also responding to. And I think, and this is already, I will come back to that as for the second question, but I really believe that this is also something that multilateralism is what should also stand for as a response to that. I think the economic risks are also very, very important to be noted here. Of course, with the coal phase out, there might be some areas which are more affected, some less. But we should also see at the opportunities that are brought to this through this transition. I leave it to this at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excuse the mobile phone. I'm always telling students when I give a lecture to turn your mobile phone off, and then we always get hit by somebody ringing us up at an opportune moment. Thank you. So, Nick, from the point of view of the COP presidency for this year, is there enough recognition of the magnitude of the risks? As Lučka said right at the start, sometimes in the past decades we've kind of framed climate change as something that's going to hit us later on. Is there enough understanding to drive the necessary ambition at the moment?
Well, first I would go back to the scientific side, because you cannot overstate it. I mean, that's the problem I think that we have, is we are in a completely new territory. The known risks are unquantifiable, but the unknown risks as well are just beginning to be understood. There's a big scientific point that, you turn the oven on to 200 degrees and it takes time to heat up. So we've already turned carbon dioxide to the level that millions of years ago meant sea rise 20 meters higher. That's the level we're at now. We have another 20 or 30 years of build-up, and we don't know what's going to happen because we've already built it up. But the science, the physics of the world hasn't caught up. So the scale of the unknowns, I think, really are worth stopping for a minute and thinking about. And the second aspect of the unknowns, I thought, Tim, you explained well on the economic side, which is that we can measure in each, we see more than 100 degrees of temperature in the Arctic. We expected that in 100 years' time. We got it last year. We got drought and desert in other places. We got forest fires in California, which were 3 times bigger than the record last year. And so far this year, 3 times bigger than the 3 times bigger of the year before. So the speed of a completely new global environment is beginning to be understood in all of these thousands of different data points, but we haven't even begun to aggregate all of those risks into one understanding. So, we can't really say that we understand the scale of the risk, but we can say it's enormous, and it's therefore, for the UK, the #1 international priority to get on top of the risk. And I'll come back to question 2, which is make it an opportunity. But I think you have to understand the risk before you can actually adopt the right kind of response. So the final thing really is that, we try to bring all the world leaders to Glasgow, COP26, in partnership with Italy, and with a huge role for the EU and the Slovenian presidency of the EU in just a few weeks' time. And every world leader and every multilateral leader needs to come with a sense of, okay, this is a not negotiable. We have to do this. And the scale of it and the speed of it is new. We agree we need to do it. And then our negotiators and our businesses and our civil society, they've got the signal from the top that we're going to have to do it. It's going to be good for us. It's going to be very difficult, though, to transition. So, yeah, is it understood? Not really, but it's understood that it's the #1 thing. And I think that's what then gives us the kind of, policy environment we need to do what we need to do quickly enough and at scale and together multilaterally.
But if I can just follow up, Nick, you understand, I think, the cascading risks and the systemic nature. Does the whole of the global policy community understand that in the depth that they need to? Because if you underestimate the risk because you think, as one UK politician said a few years ago, a 2-degree world's going to be nicer because we can wear our T-shirts more often, have nicer summers. That's the 2 degrees implies that it's just a little bit warmer on average. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about absolutely catastrophic risks. Is that new knowledge and the speed with which things are changing that you articulated, is that deeply enough embedded in the UNFCCC whole community that you're going around the world talking to?
Well, I think in all of the governments around the world, there are many things to deal with. #1, COVID, and then #2 and 3, jobs and economy. And also all of these things create a very crowded space for all countries. So I think one challenge is giving the focus to this agenda because it affects everything else. So no, I don't think the focus is quite there. No, I don't think, everybody in their lives has enough time to understand all of these consequences. But one of the most important things is that the Paris Agreement is done, and it says, below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. So in a way, the science could change, and that could change, and it could be more urgent and need doing faster. But at least we have already set a very, very challenging goal, and everybody knows the goal. Everybody signed up to the goal, and what Glasgow is about is saying we did the Paris Agreement 5 years ago, but we didn't do anything like the commitments that are needed to manage the risk. So Glasgow is about a huge jump in the commitments by everybody, and it's halving emissions by 2030. and it's supporting the countries that are already decimated. So finance and policy.
Thank you very much, Nick. So moving on to Elina remotely, from your perspective around mainstreaming policy solutions internationally, do you think there is enough understanding of the risks to be able to drive that sort of ambition that Nick was talking about? Elina, did you hear the question? Is she on mute? No? Can't hear her. Hang on a second.
I'm just unmuting myself, and then it seems to be a little bit of a delay in the audio, so I hope my hands move in the right time with my voice.
Yes, we can see you
and
hear you well.
Can you hear me?
Yes. So
can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us? Apparently not. We'll come back to you in a minute.
Okay, I think there's a mismatch between the audio and the picture, but let me try and address your question.
Thank you.
But with a delay, so please be patient with me. I will start. Okay. Okay, so as a policymaker,
can we try and sort that out and move on to Werner? Yes. We'll come back to you, Elina. So Werner, from the investment community perspective, to be able to tackle a risk, you have to understand enough about the risk to understand the costs and benefits of tackling it and how to invest. Are you content there is enough information and knowledge within the system to allow the community fully to respond to the magnitude of the problem?
Thank you so much for inviting me and for putting this question to me. And before I respond with a probably depressing answer, let me say that I'm on the optimistic side when it comes to Glasgow, because I've never seen a COP being prepared with such an awareness of the political leaders of the urgency. So this has changed this time, and so therefore we might be able to cultivate some hope that people will be ready to take decisions. Because now the political community, and certainly in the business community, I think the awareness is there. The biggest risk is to do nothing. So what do we need to do? In that context, I've been trying to understand what I've explained to my students decades ago, and that's the difference between risk and uncertainty. This dividing line is being blurred more and more. As a banker, we are always proud to be able to manage risks because that's an integral part of any bank business. And now we found out in natural disasters this year that we have been surprised because we have run into not identifiable or quantifiable risks and have been hit by uncertainty. So the classical difference between uncertainty and risk does not really work out here. And we have seen that we might have to bridge the gap between uncertainty thinking and risk thinking quickly, because otherwise our balance sheets might be seriously shaken in the next years. So from that point of view, I'm optimistic that we at least will rise to that challenge. The risk that we don't do anything or that we allow ourselves some complacency is definitely there, because we believe that we are the greatest heroes in the world when we live up to the 1.5 degree temperature rise, And we still know that if we manage that fantastic objective, we still will see a rise of the sea level by 2 meters. And you can fight about the calculation whether this is going to be 50 or 70 years, but it will come. We know that. So all the time when we are talking about adaptation, we're already basically accepting defeat. So I think a little bit more humility in the approach to this challenge might lead to the recognition of the fact that we need to act now. And whether we then are unable to do the dosage very, very precisely or might overdo something, that's a different question. But there is certainly no way to stay away from it. And as far as the bank is concerned, we must try much more to internalize the risks of not understanding uncertainties.
Great. Well, thanks very much to everyone other than Elina for contributing to that round of questions. Now moving on to the meat. Given the risks and our understanding of the uncertainties associated with those risks, what should we be doing about it? And again, if we just do a round robin, so starting off with the kind of climate expertise, Lučka, what should we be doing, balancing the adaptation and the mitigation risks, costs and benefits and so on?
Well, of course, one idea is to do something about exposure, so to mitigate climate change, but the other way is also to raise our adaptive capacity, because adaptive capacity is something, yes, it's sad that we are partly defeated because we are talking about that. But, well, working with young people, working as a teacher and a researcher, for sure we can increase adaptive capacity by spreading the science, so investing in science to be less certain. Because in many countries, climate change science is not very well financed and not very well organized. Because in many countries, you need studies because global results are not applicable. You know, in many countries, you need scenarios for cities, for special areas and of concern. And so investing in climate change science, investing in climate change education. But I'm not just talking about education at the level of primary schools, which are actually good everywhere. Yeah, sometimes children, age of 10, know much more about climate change than their parents. So I'm talking about long-time learning. And it would be very nice that politicians should learn about climate change from a scientific point of view. MPs, for instance, because they get the function, they will decide about adaptation, they will decide about mitigation efforts, but maybe they are not sure actually what are they deciding upon. The role of media, because media is extremely important, social media and classical media. We should handle that in a way that we will not be faced with the fake news, and we will not, in climate change response, get the same situation like with the virus. You know, skeptics talking about nonsense from a scientific point of view. But if I often, this is my worst nightmare, because when I'm falling COVID situation, and I said to myself, well, if we would ask those same people about climate change issues, how will they react? Maybe the same approach, which is catastrophic, because we have to act now. But of course, mitigation, it's climate change. We have to lower or stay within 350 ppm. This is our goal. It's not just stopping emissions, but also we have to think about sinks, CO2 sinks, technologies. So science has not been taken so seriously. So I would suggest to do that.
Thank you very much. Can we get Koko back remotely? No? Oh, hello, Koko. You're back. Sorry, we lost you from the screen. So, Koko, given our understanding of risks and the uncertainties of those risks...
I'm starting to speak because I don't know if there's a time lag. How is that?
Carry on. What should we do about it, Koko?
Hello. what should we do about it? If I'm going to go back to what I reflected on from the IPCC, released in August. Imagine that, on average, the world is at 1.5 degrees in the coming few years, around 2030. What could that mean for a farmer and food production? So if you dig into the report, you see that a heat event that could disrupt crops, which might be 1 in 10, maybe happen 1 year out of 10, now will happen every single year after 1.5, for example. What would that mean for action? Well, it may mean, if you think of resilience as a continuum, it may mean that to preempt those risks to food production, that farmers could be enabled to invest in soil regeneration and really increase the buffering capacity of natural ecosystems like soils. It may mean for planning that society is more socialized towards the potential greater variance in food production. That may mean implications for water use, more efficient and less water use. In the area that I'm from, in the western United States, we have one major river system, the Colorado River system. And in the coming years, in the state that I'm from, population is supposed to double. That has a lot of implications for planning for water use, for example, including for farmers. And the last thing that I would say in terms of what can be done now, and these are all contemporary things, they're not necessarily preparing us for climate change long term, but we're not doing them yet. So we need to foster these kinds of things, is to think about contingency measures. And I really appreciated the last remarks about the finance system. What could be done to help farmers, for example, manage the greater variance in food production that they might face in relation to more frequent heat events. That may mean risk transfer. It may mean restructuring debt. It may mean a whole bunch of things across institutions, across society, and of course, practice. I'm trying to keep it brief, and I know there's a time lag, but we see resilience as a spectrum, and we need to do all of those things, and there's no time like the present.
There's no time like the present. That's a comment on our technology as well as on the climate change situation. So thank you, Koko. Moving now on to the kind of policy sphere as opposed to the science, education and people sphere. Moving on to the policy sphere. Tina, what should we be doing, and are we doing it as well as we could do within the kind of international climate negotiations that you're part of?
I think, first of all, in my opinion, the mitigation and adaptation of climate change are actually part of the same coin. And I think if we do more on mitigation, we will obviously have less of adaptation. And I think this is something also to be kept in mind for the upcoming negotiations and the commitments that we are all waiting for especially from the major emitters on this road to COP26. I think at the moment we have the unprecedented urgency to really step up with these commitments, and of course with the actions. And as mentioned, we have the mitigation and adaptation, and of course then we also have the driving force, which is finance. And I think the parties, when signing the Paris Agreement, they have committed to work towards these long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And now there's also the opportunity for the actual action in this regard. I think what we also see at this moment in particular is that we need to build trust amongst the developing and developed countries. And in order to have the trust rebuilt or built, I think once more I would emphasize the importance of finance, the importance of the reaching of the commitment that the developed states, parties committed to, which is this 100 billion goal of raising finance per year for developing countries. We are not there yet. We know that, and I think it's really, really important to start working on this in order to, as I mentioned before, to rebuild the trust. We know that mitigation action will not be enough. As the EU, also as the EU presidency in this moment, I think we are aware that the adaptation action is really crucial. We are currently also working on the EU adaptation communication, which will be hopefully submitted until COP26, also really to showcase the best practices, what has been done in the EU in this context, and to also show the commitment to the partners in this process. I would leave it to here. Thank you.
Thank you. But if I can ask a follow-up. So clearly, COVID means that everybody's more economically constrained than beforehand. And if there is a finite pot of money, investing in mitigation reduces the risks in the long term, but they don't reduce the risks immediately. How is your thinking about that balance of adaptation versus mitigation, risks and benefits? And then, given that a lot of the risks are not your exposure to local hazards, but are these cascading risks that come through climate vulnerable countries not adapting fast enough, how can the international community do more to drive forward the ability of developing countries to deliver their own national agendas?
I think in particular, coming back to the COVID, let's say, recovery at this point, I think first of all it should be taken really as an opportunity for a change, as this driver towards the green transition, which we also know that has to be at the same time also just. I think this would be one important element to be mentioned. And as you mentioned as well, the cascading risks, I think we also have to be aware of those in terms of what does it really mean globally, where would this take us in terms of security relations, in terms of migration, the financial markets, and so. I think we have to look at these issues as mitigation and adaptation as the interlinked, as an intertwined, and we need to have, as mentioned before, a global response to that.
Thank you. So a need for a global response, need for greater ambition, need for helping developing world with 100 billion. So Nick, COP26, is it going to deliver to the extent that we would like it to?
Well, I said that the Paris Agreement was signed, and so we all know, the headline goal. And then Glasgow, COP26 is then implementing and convincing the markets, convincing people that governments are absolutely on this trajectory, and everything, needs to shift. Number one is the emissions reduction. Basically, we need the whole world to have the net zero, where everybody stops contributing as soon as possible. It's generally around 2040, 2050. China has carbon neutrality by 2060. We need that absolute end point to be as soon as possible, but we need it to be locked in. In the UK, it's legislated. We want as much, absolute, certainty as possible. But the second emissions number is the 2030 number, because if we don't do about a halving by 2030, we can't do the management of the temperature rise. So we're having to bring forward, everyone's plans, as Tina mentioned, across the G20, particularly is where the responsibility lies. The G7 made a very important commitment earlier this year to be 1.5 degrees compatible, and we need the rest of the big countries to step up before COP. So that's the kind of emissions goal, the 1.5. The second we've said is this combination of financing, supporting the poorest, most vulnerable countries. Yes, the 100 billion, absolutely critical, but then linking it across to the financial markets where there are trillions and trillions of dollars that, again, by 2030, all need to be sustainably invested. You know, an unbelievable transition, unbelievable challenge, unbelievable opportunity. And then you've got to actually then get that finance where it's needed and spent wisely and humbly, you know, listening to the people on the ground. What do they need? When do they need it? You know, we have the technology, we have the small scale, disintermediated, community-owned solar projects that, you know, can provide electricity to the 400 million people who don't even have electricity. We have, you know, the electrification of transport. We have hydrogen coming on. We know how to do this, but we are not getting the money to the countries that are most affected. And they were not the countries who created the problem. So there is an absolutely clear political challenge and responsibility there from one group to another. So mitigation, you know, emissions, adapting and financing. And on finance, you know, the big countries, we're still looking in Europe for, you know, big countries to step up, in the US to step up. You know, we are in countries that are spending collectively trillions on our COVID response and on our green investments, but we've not yet stepped up with much, much smaller amounts for the international community. So we've got to make that link and deliver before COP. The third thing is a little more maybe technical, or, you know, but there is a rule book for the Paris Agreement, and unless we all agree the rules, the agreement doesn't work. So there are thousands of pages that Tina is going to be looking across to just agree the rules of the road. How do we measure the emissions? Where are they? You know, what are the verification processes for reduction? How do we set up the international carbon markets under Article 6? How do we secure the future finance flows? All of these things have to get agreed. But it's not just then the multilateral thing. The other part of collaboration is that governments got together in Paris. In Glasgow, everyone has to play the part. So cities, regions, businesses especially. So we've created something called the Race to Zero, where thousands of businesses, cities, mayors, you know, governors, trying to empower local communities to say, you know, whatever's happening at the national level, whatever's happening at the global level, we can do something locally. And actually, if we do it, we will get better economic opportunities, better societal outcomes, better health outcomes. So those are the big three kind of actions: the emissions piece, the financing and the support piece, and then everyone's involved, and the sector transformations. The Prime Minister says coal, cash, cars, and trees. You know, so we've got these big, significant agreements we need to do at COP. Every day of COP we'll do with a different big sectoral delivery, and we need everyone's support for that kind of ambition. We've said it's a very high ambition because we just have no choice, but it, you know, it rests on a lot of action between now and then.
So given the urgency, given its very high ambition, if we don't meet that ambition, do we kiss goodbye to 2 degrees? Or do we have any kind of buffering space? What are the risks of failure? Or are you just supremely confident that everybody will see sense and come to the table recognising that a deal has to be done?
Well, there's obviously not just one moment in time. The G20 meets the weekend before COP. That's another huge moment in time. The UN meets the month before COP, another huge moment. Next year, there's implementation of all the things we agree. So there's many, many steps. But it's just that you have to really have these significant concrete, you know, and things then move exponentially. The bad things happen exponentially, but the good things happen exponentially. You can go overnight, you know, in the UK from having 40% coal to 1 or 2% coal, like in 5 years, because offshore wind is now cheaper. and it just flips and goes off the scale. Mobile phones, we all know, just off the scale. So that's the dynamic. So there's no one moment, but this has to be one of many successful moments. And then there's many years more of, continuing delivery.
Great. So it sounds like you're optimistic still. So obviously it's your job, but yes.
I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I mean, I think you just need to understand the reality and then just be serious about the actions and, go from there.
Thanks, Nick. So we've got our remote people back on screen. Welcome back. I hope some of the technical issues have been solved. So, Elina, your turn. I don't know whether you've caught any of the other parts of it, but what should we be doing about the risks from your perspective?
Tim, and a real pleasure to be a part of such distinguished and well-known, familiar panel. And I'm very sad I can't be with you in person, as these technical problems sometimes get unsurmountable. But nevertheless, let me try and quickly answer a little bit of both questions in the interest of time. Firstly, I'd like to just reflect that as a policymaker and as a policymaker in the Commission for the past 17 years, I think what we've seen is a really radical increase in the awareness of the risk, in the awareness of climate science, and genuinely an effort to integrate these aspects into all decision making. Of course, as you will know, the Commission puts forward its policy proposals based on an extensive impact assessment of the economic, social, and environmental consequences. We use the IPCC scientific data, we use our Joint Research Centre data, which is modelling things up to 2100 and beyond, in terms of climatic changes, in terms of the impacts that it will have on GDP, on people's well-being, and increasingly the risks. And as was said before, what we have also seen is that the emphasis almost exclusively on mitigation has become increasingly balanced. We now accept that even if we were able to keep temperature increase within the 1.5 degree threshold, there are still going to be climatic consequences that we need to live with, and every 0.1 degree increase will amplify those impacts. So risks and risk thinking, resilience, ability of our economies to withstand the inevitable consequences of climate change, many of which we saw over the summer, has become very much a part of the policy making. I would agree that that there has been a notion of somehow using time on adaptation being a defeatist way of working, whereas in today's realities, I think we have felt that there is no responsible way forward without having systemic adaptation strategies, being more prepared at EU level, and also sharing that know-how and information at the level of global actors. So the international part that has been now included in our new adaptation strategy from February last year has an extensive component on cooperation on early warning mechanisms, risks, resilience. And I think this is evidence of us not just focusing on mitigation, which undoubtedly remains the best way to control risks, but also pragmatically looking at the realities as they are today and being best prepared, as the climate science, as many speakers before me said, is very uncertain. There are different thresholds that passing of which can create exponential shifts this way or that way, and we simply don't know enough in order to predict fully what the consequences will be. One word, if you allow, on the risks of the net zero transition. And I think this is somewhere where we should definitely not underestimate the risks of societal unacceptance. So when policymakers put in place ambitious mitigation strategies, take the Fit for 55 package, it will have an impact on the very texture of our society, economy, and industry. And this is something that has to be understood. And we have to put in place mechanisms and support that allows us to address it in the transformation in a way that keeps the civil society support, keeps the industry support, and leaves no one behind. The change can only be accepted if it's attainable, affordable, and accessible. And these are the key dilemmas that we deal with every day of our kind of working processes. I'm still very, very optimistic. Some glimpses that I heard of the other interventions talked about, how internet has risen, how mobile phones, how things like Netflix that we did not think of just, say, 2010 or 5 years ago, have become such a huge part of our everyday reality that the transformative technologies are also going to be penetrating the marketplace. Should we have the right incentive structures in place, and should we be responsible enough to avail information and make those technologies accessible to the wider communities? And here I'm not just talking within Europe, but also at a global level. As EU being responsible for just 8% of global emissions, it can have an impact, but it will never be sufficient. Every single partner must act, and like Nick, the EU and the UK presidency, the EU will be working to maximize the pressure and incentives and encouragement towards our international partners to enhance their NDCs in advance of COP26. Because as we stand today, the NDCs are not enough to keep us within the 1.5 degrees, not even within the 2 degrees. The hard reality today is that Paris Agreement, as good as it is, will deliver only the ambition that the parties to Paris Agreement are willing to deliver. And for the time being, before we get the next UNFCCC synthesis report, we're still heading to 2.7 to 3.2 degrees. And this is something that needs to be considered seriously. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a very concise and brilliant intervention. So we'll soon be moving on to question and answers, so think of questions. But to hand the biggie to Werner as our last intervention, with all of the trillions of investment available, how do we leverage that investment for the most climate positive outcomes? And how do we actually, as Nick said, it's not really about the politics. It's ultimately about transforming our economies. How do we use the investment? How do we direct the investment to make sure that that happens?
In view of the fact that it is very difficult to calculate or predict outcomes of action, you might be tempted to do nothing. We know exactly which direction we need to go, so we better go. And therefore, we need to know, do we need to move out of fossil fuel financing, for instance, and all these things we have said in the UN General Assembly 2 years ago. These things should be recognized, are more and more recognized nowadays. By the way, sometimes more by the private sector than by the public sector. If I read what Mr. Fink from BlackRock is writing about the need to move out of fossil fuel assets, then I think we can learn from that also on the public side. So this is something that needs to be done. But then we have agreed to certain quantitative objectives, and we will do that again in Glasgow. But please also think about the necessary milestones there, because otherwise we might wake up one day and say, oh, sorry, didn't make it. So we need to know what the interim steps will be. And on this journey, we need to do much more in order to crowd in the private sector. All public money, all taxpayers' money in the world will not suffice to finance the objectives that we need to tackle now. Now, we have some experience in that. When we issued the first green bonds in 2007 at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, my colleagues at that time were considered lunatics. Well, this lunatic market is now worth $1 trillion, so it is not so bad. But what we found out immediately is you need to safeguard these activities. You need to make sure that the investors who give us the money can rely upon the purpose of the investments that we are going to pursue. So the green bond principles were the next step. Now it's going to be the taxonomy. And some people are afraid it might develop into a bureaucratic monster. That is a risk. But on the other hand, we need, in order to crowd in the private sector, reliability on that front. Then I believe, indeed, we can do it. And all in all, I think, and you mentioned the issue of developing countries here, that's very close to my heart. We all know that we don't produce more than 8% of CO2 emissions. So we have to see it from a global point of view. And there I'd say, if I only look at Africa and the need to multiply the productivity, the production of electricity in the next 20 years by the factor of 4, then we better make sure that we put the right power plants there, otherwise the SDGs will go up in smoke, literally. So these are things where the Europeans have a mission, because in this field of clean technologies, we are the market leaders. And this is a position we should exploit now. And then we have a serious chance. And this is why I believe, also by encouraging the link between climate, innovation, and development, inseparable, we have an opportunity that makes me a little bit more optimistic. I believe with doomsday scenarios, we will not solve the problem, but with trust in our can-do and the ability to produce necessary technologies we'll need in order to reach these objectives and the milestones there.
Thank you very much. So we've now got half an hour or so for questions to any or all of the panel. I believe we've got somebody who's got a microphone. Have we got a microphone? Yes, we've got a microphone at the back. So first question to the gentleman with the microphone.
Good evening. What is the protocol? I have to present myself, or
yes, please do introduce yourself.
My name is Ibrahim Nuhu. I'm from Slovenia, and I was born in Mali, exactly in the Sahel region. So this topic is very important for me because in my lifetime I saw and I see change in the climate locally. No? If I tell you that I'm coming from Sahel, as a child, I used to see that in Sahel we have a lot of trees, we had a lot of grass for our animals, and life was beautiful. And today, I will have a question. Just allow me a little comment, a little history. I will not be long, be sure. And now, when I tell you that, because why I'm here in Slovenia, because I came to study forestry in a country like Mali, who is not rich in forest. So this is a vision, because at this moment, as students, we came to learn about forest, to go back and share solutions for our problems. So for me, this climate change is not a big issue for me. The big issues are some problems in which man is involved, and also big politics. So when I come back to the climate change, for men of Sahel, what is the solution? The solution is to plant trees, the solution is to recover the grasses, and the solution is that our animals will have a lot of food. So in this case, we will not have migration, as the young lady says about migration and climate change. When I was in Slovenia, the big issue when I'm studying forestry, the big issue was the dying of forest in Europe because of acid rains. And at this moment, all Europe peoples, scientists, the population was aware. Me myself, I was involved in research in the valley of Lučka in Slovenia, where we get solution. So at this moment, Europe come together and they share solutions for the rainforest. It was not so easy, but the solution came. Why? Because they did investigation and they said, okay, because of industrialization, we have rainforest in all Europe. And also because the winds are going to where all Europe was undamaged. And after this, we get solution, made some innovation, as you said, and the solution is today, the forests in Europe, especially in Slovenia, are very green. If you go to see a photo of a forest 30 years ago, it was very, very dramatic. So, my question is, because the situation is the problem, the phenomenon of climate change is global, why, for the panel, did you have some local solutions that people who are listen to you as a brilliant scientist can understand? Because what is the solution? One local solution. Because just talking about climate change, it makes big confusions. And the politician will take advantage of this and make troubles in the world.
Okay, so thank you. So if I can paraphrase your question, the issue of climate change has global causation, but has local impacts. And climate change in itself is a threat multiplier, so it can make a marginal situation that's marginal through causes not from climate change much worse, and you mentioned the Syrian crisis. Whole range of different things. So climate change is not always the sole cause, but how do we find those local solutions that remove the threat acceleration aspect of local unsustainability in the broad sense? How do we downscale from the global to the local? So, Lukasz, if I can ask you first, there is a technical problem to do with downscaling the climate science, but there is also the way that climate interacts with local issues that requires local solutions which are not global solutions.
Well, my opinion is that you mentioned that climate change is multiplier, but I see it as a magnifying glass. You have one minor problem, not climate change related. You did something wrong, something unsustainable with your forest, with your land use in general. And then with the climate change, this small problem grows and becomes sometimes with no solution. So I guess that local solutions should be based on now I would not say the sound mind, but on sustainable recipes, if I may say so, because this is something that will best equip you with coping with climate change. Otherwise, small problems, as I mentioned, will grow. But I will really like to say something about land use changes, because we just talk about fossil fuels, we talked about technical solution. Land use issues are extremely important, but they cannot have a global solution, I guess. It's their local, their state sovereignty is something that we cannot avoid. But I think in the Glasgow there will be also talks about land use. So land use is something that is very important, and one of the very important local solutions is also to use ingenious knowledge of the people who lived there maybe a century ago, to use some practices that modern approach to life has forgotten. But in case of adaptation, such things can come really handy. It's about water use, it's about land use in general, forests and things like that.
Thank you. Koko, as a vulnerability expert, you mentioned proper soil management earlier. That's obviously within this kind of ballpark. Have you got anything to say about local community actions and so on?
Well, to add to this amazing panel, My thoughts were actually going in a slightly different direction, and we're inspired constantly by great examples from more local levels, subnational levels, about good things going on. And so actually I was thinking of scaling up. What can be done to scale up, to remove barriers, to facilitate taking up of good solutions? And of course, just complementing what's already been said, making sure that the buffer systems, whether they're natural, really taken care of. Humans have an amazing potential to regenerate ecosystems. Soil regeneration is one example. Taking care of forests, mimicking nature. There, we could just go on and on. There's so many things that people can do systematically to enhance the buffering capacity of nature. And ultimately, that's, of course, always happening at a local level and can be enhanced through institutional systemic things that happen at different levels. So just a shout out to that. In the work that I supervise at the UNFCCC, we're gathering cases like the gentleman from the Sahel talked about, of good adaptation practice. And we're also identifying those gaps, particularly knowledge gaps, that are barriers to scaling up adaptation action. And we're learning a lot. The last thing that I would, I did want to bring in, whether it's something that Werner said earlier or the other speakers, also Elina, ultimately adaptation is done by people or groups of people. And there will be, and is right now, a great need to socialize ideas and to engage people in talking about those potential solutions. Since you mentioned, Elina, I started daydreaming when you mentioned technology and things like streaming. You mentioned Netflix. In our cultures, in many cultures, what we see played out in stories, not necessarily only Netflix, but the stories help audiences engage with potential solutions. Stories foster our imaginations, and they also help us vicariously explore whether certain solutions are acceptable, what the problems are, what success looks like. And I think we need that kind of enhanced exchange, whether it's through storytelling and entertainment, whether it's through news. Werner, you mentioned the news. I think climate journalism has a tremendous role to play in reminding its readers, these are the goals. For example, Nick, you mentioned the Paris Agreement has milestones. It has commitments and goals. Wouldn't it be great if climate journalism could unpack the milestones and foster society's engagement in that? Because ultimately, again, circling back to Elina, those solutions need to have societal acceptance. We've seen it with COVID. Some societies are trying to impose rules, public health, for example, and some are relying on almost totally voluntary measures. Of course, there's going to be a mix, but we can't leave society behind. People have to be engaged in understanding what are the milestones, what are the possible solutions, what does success look like. So those are some ingredients that are also part of institutions fostering adaptation and adaptation actually happening on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Koko. Does anybody else have, there's a question over here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the excellent discussion. While there are a lot of examples of things that can give us optimism, be it institutional funding that's migrating towards investing into climate solutions, corporate investing, even the public awareness based upon what we're seeing in the climate disasters that are happening all around us. The NDCs that we're going to the COP don't meet the goals. The NDCs, the agreements in Paris have not been met. I hear a lot of, this is a panel on resiliency, but I haven't heard anything on accountability. Where is the accountability coming out of Glasgow?
Thank you. Nick, straight to you.
Yeah, very good question. And I mentioned that once you've got the Paris Agreement, we've not yet got the rule book completed, which is the rules of the road that you refer to and the accountability. The nature of the Paris Agreement, after many years before that of trying for global legally binding, was to settle on nationally determined targets that then aggregate to a global action plan, as you know. So what we're trying to be creating is the greatest possible both certainty, and that's why I mentioned the UK has got legislation, statutory legislation for net zero, which gives our business community and our citizens, the highest possible degree that you can, that we mean it, and this is the investment signal. So we want as much, the national level, and then down to the regional and the city level, of that kind of thing, that kind of legislative or regulatory certainty that then allows things to happen. And then you get positive stories. Koko makes the vital point about stories. You get one example of something that's working really well and exciting, and then hundreds, can follow more quickly. So I think it's about generating, in each country, also, citizen pressure. The polling now is that people want action. They just want to know what the government's going to do, what businesses are going to do. So we've got that signal. Let's turn it into regulation. Let's turn it into legislation. There are thousands of pieces now of legislation and regulation since Paris that have taken place. But we now need to see it then beginning to look different around us. And I just want to say a point to the gentleman from Sahel, because it's linked. The biggest thing that we can do in the industrialized world is get our own house in order, because we have created the problem. And the trajectories, that we have begun to, turn down need to get to zero fast. And then the big emerging economies also know the trajectories that they need. So it's only if we get our house in order, you are left with a very different scenario in the Sahel. And then when you try and adapt and be more resilient, you've got a better chance, because we have reduced the problem. But the second thing we have to do is, as was said, I think Elina and Koko touched on, understanding the reality locally and what's needed in different places, and increasing the support in the way that support can be useful. It's not, it used to talk so much about aid money, and now it's about so much more than that. It's finding out how to support, share knowledge, share techniques, listen. If you listen to the way that the Bangladeshi community has dealt with extreme flooding and reduced by, it's something like 98%. It's a crazy improvement in disaster management that they have done locally. We don't in the UK know as much as they know. So it's then about that exchange of experience. But it's all going to happen at the local level and build up and aggregate.
Thanks, Nick. Turning to Werner, although the question was about kind of political responsibility, there is obviously a huge role for financial responsibility and the whole transparency, TCFD, etc. How can we make sure that the investment community, the corporate community, take these responsibilities seriously to deliver? You mentioned right at the start that actually the corporate community, in some sense, is going much faster than governments. How can we make sure that those investments are really driving the positive systemic change that we want, and they're not subject to greenwashing or the kind of global silver bullet of offsetting or BECS or whatever it might be?
With all my optimism, I'm also a realist and I'm not naive, and this is why I have a lot of sympathy for the question on accountability. This can be addressed only by strict reporting, transparency, and responsibility. And this is something that needs to be further elaborated, I'm sure. And in this context also, we should not allow too much thinking in terms of offsets, because sometimes we are simply taking a burden from our shoulders by financing a little bit of a burden taken through others. And this leads us at the end of the day into the wrong direction. So I would insist that, of course, we always need to avoid the bureaucratic monsters. But without transparency and clean reporting, we will not get the thing done.
So that needs regulation.
Yeah, absolutely, because we will not find the investors to give us the money. We need to refinance totally on the capital markets. And there you have pretty bright people. And they really go for green investments nowadays. That attitude of the asset holders has totally changed over the last 10 years. But they want to be reassured. And this is why the catchwords of transparency and accountability, and that means reporting, must be implemented.
And within globalized markets,
Absolutely.
How do you get the international governance to drive that ahead? Or is that down to places like the City of London developing a regulatory framework and hoping that that scales to other markets? Or is there an international governance regime?
The potential investors go to the safest place. And I don't want to make an advertiser here for the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, but I must say they have developed a framework which the investors from around the world consider reliable. And this is something that can be replicated if you make sure that nobody reduces his or her ambition.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question over here, and we'll probably have time for one more question after this.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to touch on the global-local dimension and have a question for Nick and Elina. My name is Esther Burscher, and I represent the off-grid energy sector as well as a leading company in that. And I have a practical question. Sorry. So my name is Esther Burscher. I represent the off-grid energy sector and a leading company in that. And I have a practical question for Elina and Nick to that respect, thinking about the socialization that you mentioned, Nick, as well as the gentleman talking about the local, global dimension. Because how does it work if, for instance, we as a company in a sector which currently has a fossil origin-based product, we're investing in Europe and in the US, for instance, particularly for renewable or defossilized alternatives. But at the same time, whilst you're doing the legislation and you're making it a very steep time frame when you look at 2030, how do we make sure that we don't deprive Africa, Asia, and parts of LATAM of particularly off-grid cleaner alternatives? Because the change is always, and the energy transition is what you transition from. And if, for instance, if you transition from coal, if you transition from heating oil, or 2 billion people in the world who are still cooking, for instance, on woody biomass, outdoor, but also indoor from a health perspective, I'm just wondering, how do we make sure that whilst we're catching up and taking responsibility in Europe and Northern America, that we don't deprive these regions from a first step in that energy transition ladder?
Thank you. Elina, that was addressed to you. Do you want to take that first and then Nick?
I'd be happy to. I think this is one of the greatest paradoxes and dilemmas that we deal with, not just at a European level, but at a global level. And I think there are no panacea, there's no silver bullets here. But at the same time, I think the resolve to transition away from fossil fuel has to be projected in all activities, including external financing. And if you look at the recent G7 language, the G7 countries have all committed to not just net zero by 2050, but overwhelmingly decarbonized power systems by 2030. And that's a pretty amazing commitment. In addition, there is an absolute end to external financing of unmitigated, unabated coal. Yes, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier. In order for us to succeed at a global level, we have to be in a position to provide attainable and accessible alternatives, and accept also that in the transition, there will need to be solutions that are based on gas as a transition fuel, but that the infra that supports that solution is compatible with CCS or to be transmitting non-fossil energy sources in the longer run. So because we cannot afford to allow Africa or India or any of our partners that are still working their way up that energy access line to invest their scarce resources in soon-to-be redundant technologies, such as coal. That would be irresponsible. So instead, we need to look at solutions that allow leapfrogging solar, wind, other renewable energy sources, which in many regions are quite abundant. Many of those regions which are still struggling with energy access. But our international cooperation will be directed in line with this. There are, EIB has very good and ambitious external lending guidelines, and what we do internally has to be confidently and pragmatically projected also externally. But there are no blacks and whites.
Thank you very much, Elina. Nick, anything to add to that?
I would just quickly reinforce the importance of a fair playing field. So we're still subsidizing fossil fuel far more than renewable or clean energy. And in the last year, as we've begun to realize the scale of the emergency and the scale of the speed at which we want to go, in the last year we've seen very, very encouraging movement very quickly. No new coal from Pakistan, 450 gigawatts of solar from India. We and a large number of international partners, no more international fossil fuel financing. So huge movements, but a huge way, as you know, a long way to go to level and make fair the playing field. And if you make it fair, the clean stuff is already cheaper. We're not even talking in this panel about 8 million people who die every year prematurely from air quality, which is mostly fossil fuel or energy or cars. 8 million people. If you begin to properly price that, then you begin to see the shift. So I think it's about, as a policymaker, you're thinking about the responsibility to accelerate the move to a fair playing field.